Thank you. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Seismic Risk and Resilience in Utah. We have a great panel of speakers today. I'm excited for you to all hear this. Welcome on behalf of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. EERI was established in 1948, and we're the leading nonprofit membership organization that connects professionals from a wide range of disciplines who are dedicated to better understanding earthquake risk and advancing earthquake resilience around the world. I want to let you know a bit about the conference we'll be holding this summer in Salt Lake City from June 27th to July 1st, the 12th National Conference on Earthquake Engineering. This webinar will give you a preview of some of the exciting discussions and events that are planned for the conference. If you'd like more information, you can visit the website, and registration is open now. So I'll be turning it over to Sean McGowan, who's the co-chair of the organizing committee of 12NCE, to introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and hi, everybody, and welcome. So my name is Sean McGowan, and I'm the Earthquake Program Manager for FEMA Region 8 based in Denver, and we work with Mountain West states, including Utah. And I'm a structural engineer by background, and along with my co-chair, Barry Welliver, I just want to welcome you all to this webinar, and we're really excited for the 12th National Conference on Earthquake Engineering coming up at the end of June. And we hope to see you there. But in the meantime, this is a bit of a teaser, kind of show you some of the work going on in Utah and highlight some of the great people behind that work. And I'm really excited about this webinar because it highlights 4 of the key areas in the earthquake world. And I think most of you come from probably one of these disciplines, so this won't be a surprise. I think it really encapsulates the interdisciplinary strength of EERI. So today we'll talk about earthquake risk in Utah with a focus on the science, the engineering, the policy, and the people. I think we all know, we've learned from EERI conferences in the past, if you take away one of those 4, you're really kind of fighting with one arm behind your back, because I think it takes this interdisciplinary approach to really advance earthquake mitigation. And so I think you'll see that clear as day from these presenters. And each panelist is going to provide some brief remarks, and then at the end, we'll open it up to question and answer. So if you do have any questions along the way, please feel free to submit those to the question and answer. You'll see in the bottom of your Zoom screen, there'll be a Q&A tab, and you can click on that and send us your questions. We'll make sure we cover as many as time allows. And what's actually really exciting about this, in addition to the conference coming up, is there's some really exciting work going on in Utah right now, like national class, fantastic work being done by a broad group of people that have been at it for 2-3 decades. And really, it's coming to a head now, and there's a lot of good momentum. And so each of our speakers that you see today has been an integral part of that process. These aren't just random people from these backgrounds that we thought might be helpful. They're integrally involved in the process of mitigating earthquake risk in Utah. So with that, I'll hand it over to the experts to introduce the first speaker today. So Emily Klaber is the hazards geologist specializing in earthquakes at the Utah Geologic Survey in Salt Lake City, Utah. And she has a BS in geology from the University of California, Davis, and an MS from Arizona State University. She started working at the UGS in 2016 and has been researching paleo earthquakes in Utah and helping people understand the geologic hazards that Utah faces, especially in the Wasatch Front. And she's a great communicator of science. So with that, I'll hand it over to Emily. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited to kick this webinar off. So my name is Emily, and I'm a geologist with the Utah Geological Survey, and I specialize in earthquake geology. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about our geologic setting here in Utah, specifically on the Wasatch Front, how we study the geologic record of earthquakes, and what past earthquakes can tell us about future earthquakes. So first, for some geologic setting, here we have a map showing the tectonic setting of the Western United States. To the west, we can see tectonic plate boundaries and their corresponding faults, the San Andreas in California, and then the Cascadia subduction zone off the northwest coast of the US. Now looking further to the east, we are no longer in a plate boundary, but there's still things going on tectonically. Notice the mountain ranges and flat basins between Utah's Wasatch Range, shown here, and California's Sierra Nevada Mountain. This is called the Basin and Range Province, where tectonic forces have been extending the western part of North American plate for the past 17 million years. And this is at a rate of about 1/2 inch per year. So in response to this stretching, the rigid crust breaks and shifts along faults that are typically at the base of mountains, producing earthquakes. So Utah, where we are based, most people at this conference, or in this presenting in this webinar, Utah straddles this boundary between the Basin and Range Province that's actively extending, and then the more stable Rocky Mountains and Colorado Plateau to the east. So this boundary coincides with what we call the Intermountain Seismic Fault, which is an area of earthquake activity spanning from Montana down to northern Arizona. And Utah's longest and most active fault, Wasatch Fault, shown in black, is within the Intermountain Seismic Fault. So focusing more on Utah some more, the map on the left here shows where quaternary active faults are in Utah, and they're shown in gray. And we're also highlighting the Wasatch Fault Zone, which is in red. So these are all faults that have geologic evidence for past surface rupturing earthquakes in the last 2.6 million years. The map on the right is showing historic seismicity in Utah for greater than magnitude 5.0 earthquakes since 1850. There's more than 36,000 earthquakes that have occurred in the region since 1962, after a seismic network was established by the University of Utah. Half of the 16 most damaging earthquakes in Utah have occurred outside of the Wasatch Front, and mostly in central and southwestern Utah. So we focus a lot of attention on the Wasatch Front, but our earthquake hazards extend well outside of urban areas. Noteworthy again is the Wasatch Fault, Utah's longest and most active fault. It's 210 miles long, and it's made up of 10 individual segments. And the central 5 segments where Utah's population and economy are concentrated on the Wasatch Front are considered to be the most active. And just for some geographic reference, helpful to look for the Great Salt Lake on these maps of Utah, and then Salt Lake City is just to the southeast of Great Salt Lake. So looking at this seismological data, there is an average frequency of moderate earthquakes about every 60 years in the Wasatch Front and about every 35 years in Utah. So this data gets at a really key fact that discussing earthquakes hazards in Utah is tricky. 60 years is a long time, and small to moderate magnitude earthquakes aren't very widely felt typically. And up until the Magna earthquake, which occurred in a very dense part of Utah in terms of population, no one had been physically, financially, or emotionally affected by an earthquake. So to educate people about this risk of large earthquakes, so larger than 6.5 or so, we use the geologic record to help people understand the significant impact that a large magnitude earthquake could have on the Wasatch Front. So how do we do this? We use something called paleoseismology. So since the late 1960s, abundant paleoseismic data on surface rupturing earthquakes has been collected for the Wasatch Fault Zone and other faults in the Wasatch Front region. So in the basin and range, we generally say that earthquakes with a magnitude larger than 6.5 has the potential to rupture the surface. So that means our paleoseismic record is showing evidence for large earthquakes. Paleoseismology studies yield the timing of past earthquakes, displacement per event, and slip rate estimates. So this can create a really large data set if you have a lot of trenches. And luckily on the Wasatch Fault, we have that. We have 20 and counting detailed paleoseismic investigations showing evidence of these large magnitude earthquakes. There's also trench studies that have been done, or paleoseismology studies, I should say, that have been done on neighboring faults that sort of encompass the Wasatch Front region. And so this map here is showing the sort of central 5 segments of the Wasatch Fault that I mentioned, and all the blue dots are showing the locations for those paleoseismic studies. So motivated by this really rich data set and improved methods for analyzing paleoseismic data, a group was formed in January 2010 called the Working Group on Utah Earthquake Probabilities to start using this data in new and important ways. So this working group consisted of 14 geologists, seismologists, and engineers affiliated with federal, state, academic, and consulting organizations. And so what they put together was an earthquake forecast, much like a weather forecast. So the forecast reports that there is a 43% probability of 1 or more magnitude 6.75 or greater earthquakes in the region in the next 50 years. It also reports a 57% probability of 1 or more 6.0 or greater earthquakes in the next 50 years. This is similar odds to the flipping of a coin, 1 in 2 chance. So the 2020 Magna earthquake did not change these regional probabilities but it did really increase the public awareness of earthquakes. And so this probabilities report has been a great tool for discussing seismic hazard on the Wasatch Front. So we know how there are earthquakes in Utah, including how we find evidence for large magnitude earthquakes. So what does our hazard really look like on the Wasatch Front? Well, to get it, we're going to take a look at our most recent earthquake, the most recent moderate magnitude earthquake, the 2020 Magna earthquake. So the animation I'm going to show is seismological data collected from the University of Utah, and it's covering the earthquake sequence for about 2 months of time. So we start off looking at the Salt Lake Valley in map view, and we see the epicenter of the Magna earthquake, and then dive underneath the valley to watch the sequence. So the magnitude 5.7 main shock hypocenter shows up in pink. There it is, followed by shallower aftershocks happening right above it. And at the end of March 18th, the day of the earthquake, and into the 19th, we can see a robust sequence of aftershocks above the hypocenter. And we can start to imagine this as a west dipping fault. Finally, we see earthquakes start on another structure to the east and also up, higher up than the hypocenter, underneath the Salt Lake City Airport, which is interpreted to be the West Valley Fault Zone. And this is an east dipping fault connected to the Wasatch Fault. And the main shock stress changes are interpreted to have triggered these aftershocks. Oh, there's my timer. I'll wrap it up soon. So from this earthquake sequence, we can imagine that there's not one fault, but a whole complicated fault system dipping to the west underneath the Salt Lake Valley. Wrapping up from there. So it was a really quick introduction. I hope my presentation gave you some more good geologic context for Utah, especially on the Wasatch Front. If you want to learn more about geology in Utah, please visit the Utah Geological Survey website, geology.utah.gov. And if you're coming to the 2022 NCEE, I encourage you to attend a special session I'm involved with, chaired by Ivan Wong of Lettuce Consultants International, to learn more about the Magnaquake. And I'm also going to be leading a tour all about the geology of the Wasatch Mountains from the valleys to the peaks. So if you want to get to 11,000 feet without breaking a sweat, come join me. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Emily. And I think freaks everybody out thinking about these faults aren't just a line on a map, but they dip under the city, and there's all kinds of liquefaction potential, and a lot of people who think they're far from the fault that aren't as far as they think. And I think that explains some of the damage we saw in Magna, and just appreciate you taking the time out for that. Next up, we have Ari Bruning, JD AICP. He's the president and CEO of Envision Utah. And Ari has extensive experience in envisioning implementation efforts for regions, large areas, and critical growth related topics, basically things they don't teach in engineering school. So we're really glad to have you as a partner, Ari. And at Envision Utah, he helped lead the Your Utah Year Future statewide vision. And this was an effort that surveyed 52,000 Utahns and asked them questions about different topics, including hazards, as well as the Valley Visioning effort in Utah County, where they heard from 11,000 residents. So he's a real strength in gathering the pulse of the community and seeing what people value. And Ari has a great resume with magna cum laude, graduate of Harvard Law School, and he was a graduation speaker at Brigham Young University. And in addition to that, he's the author of several articles on urban planning, law, and religion, plus a children's book. So it's a pretty well-rounded guy. So without further ado, thank you, Ari.
Thanks, Sean. So we at Envision Utah, just to give you a brief introduction to us, we are a nonprofit 501c3, and we were created to facilitate discussions about growth and have spent most of our history talking about transportation and housing and land use. We've gotten into air quality and water, and a little over a year ago, we decided we'd tackle disaster resilience and apply kind of the same process to it. We are not experts in earthquakes or in disaster resilience, but what we are experts in is in facilitating discussion and bringing the right people to the table and help make things happen. So we jumped into this. We decided the goal was really just to heighten awareness and momentum and prioritization to this issue. See if we can't get some agreement on what really needs to happen and move policy in that direction. So we've spent the last year or so putting this project together. We invited 3 co-chairs. One of them is a professor, one's the chair of the Salt Lake Chamber, and then one is at the time was leading one of our largest development companies in Utah. So we wanted a well-rounded group leading this, put together a steering committee of everybody who had power to do something or who had expertise that we could think of, and then divided them up into 4 working groups covering homes and buildings, lifeline infrastructure, development planning, and then messaging and education. And we've spent a lot of time just meeting with folks, all sorts of stakeholders. This is just a partial list of the kinds of people we've been meeting with, trying to understand what issues are important to them and see if we can't find some common ground. One thing we've also been doing is trying to bring attention to this through getting more media coverage of the issue. So I just threw some newspaper headlines on there that have occurred over the last year or so, trying to get people more aware of the risk and of the things that we can do to mitigate that risk in advance. So with that, I think where I want to go is talk about where the project has landed so far on things that we ought to be doing in Utah to improve our seismic resilience. A lot of good things have happened over the last several decades, and this is where all the stakeholders seem to have aligned in agreement on what ought to happen. So we partnered with the Seismic Safety Commission in creating these recommendations. Utah has a Seismic Safety Commission, has for about 25 years. And one of their statutory roles is to provide recommendations to policymakers and to the legislature. So they worked with us to fulfill that mandate. And then a number of other organizations also endorsed the recommendations that came out of this group. And everybody from utilities, water providers to chambers and so forth, engineering groups. And these are the 5 recommendations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because I'm going to dive into each one on a separate slide. So first recommendation that seemed to rise to the top was making sure that after an earthquake, we're much more likely to have water service along the Wasatch Front. So our water comes from the Wasatch Mountains and beyond in these major aqueducts that of necessity cross the Wasatch Fault. Some of them cross the fault in multiple places, run through known landslide areas, liquefaction areas, and so forth. They were built in 1940s, 1950s, and are at high risk for breaking in the event of an earthquake. And what we're told is that if we're one of these to sustain significant damage, it could take up to 6 months or even more to repair it and bring water service back to the over 2 million people who live on the Wasatch Front. So you can see the map here of the service area of these. It's basically the population center of Utah. This is where 85% of Utah lives, so that are served by these aqueducts. Each of the water districts that manages the aqueducts has priced out what it would take to either harden the joints on the aqueducts or build a parallel system for redundancy, or build some more flex into the pipe. They've all looked at this engineering wise, and totaling up the cost, it's about 192 million to make these more likely to survive an earthquake, so that we have water service in the valleys. Obviously, there are lots of other places that water systems can go out, but step number 1 is let's make sure that the water actually can get into the valley. So 192 million. We just finished our legislative session. We have a very short session in Utah, 45 days every year. And there were a lot of other water priorities that I think were in line ahead of this and got funded, but I think we managed to get this on the radar screen, and hopefully we're optimistic for next year that we can get some funding directed this direction. The next 2 recommendations actually have to do with our unreinforced masonry buildings in Utah. This is where our high risk, that's pretty unique to Utah, is. It's estimated there are around 140,000 unreinforced masonry buildings in Utah because we allowed them to be built up until 1976. And they are scattered throughout the state, especially on the Wasatch Front. And they're really a thorny problem for how to deal with all of these. Some of them are schools. And so our school districts have been spending quite a bit of money and time over the last several decades retrofitting these schools, or more commonly tearing them down and rebuilding them. So we've made a lot of progress, but we still have somewhere around 120, 130 school campuses that have an unreinforced masonry building on them. And just last month, a report was released with an inventory of these schools, which was great progress. It's the first time we've had that. So it's about 70,000 students who attend these schools. You can see the picture on the bottom there is of a junior high that during that Magna earthquake that Emily talked about sustained pretty significant damage. And if it hadn't been a pandemic and kids had actually been in school, I suspect we would have seen some injuries or deaths. So the recommendation the Seismic Safety Commission approved was to fund feasibility studies on each of those schools to figure out what it would cost to retrofit or replace them, to put the districts in the position where they can make that decision, maybe apply for grants and so forth. That specific recommendation didn't get funded, but the legislature did appropriate $140 million to assist school districts with capital needs. I suspect a lot of that's going to go to seismic issues. So that's the schools. We also have a lot of homes and other buildings that are unreinforced masonry. And the Seismic Safety Commission recommended that as a first step towards tackling those, let's just increase the public awareness of them so that people, when they are shopping for a home, they know what the risk is, and see if we can apply some market pressure to upgrade some of them. So we're looking for creating that statewide awareness. There's also the state has a grant to look at creating a statewide retrofit assistance program. There's one in Salt Lake City right now called Fix the Bricks that I think you're going to hear about it a little bit more about in a minute. But the idea is to take that statewide and see if we can't help people with their retrofitting their homes. I think the Salt Lake City program is trying to do about 200 a year. So 140,000 in 700 years, we'll have them all. So it highlights the need to increase the momentum there. Fourth recommendation from the Seismic Safety Commission was to make sure that for our large buildings, so over 200,000 square feet, or risk category 3 or 4, so we're talking hospitals, schools, police stations, and so on, that when the plan review happens for the construction of that building, that it's done by a licensed structural engineer. We're hearing that a lot of them are done by folks who don't have expertise in this field. And so having that second set of eyes on these important buildings seems to be critical. And then the last recommendation from the Seismic Safety Commission was to fund a feasibility study for an earthquake early warning system in Utah. I understand that California, Oregon, Washington already have these systems in place. Utah is a little unique. The way our fault works is a little unique, and the fact that we live right on top of it also is a little unique. But which is why we needed that feasibility study to see if it would work. Give us maybe 10, 20, 30 seconds warning of the earthquake. When I first heard that, I said, what am I going to do in 10 seconds? But that's enough time to shut off natural gas, for example, to prevent fires, or shut down the tracks train, or stop a sensitive surgery. You don't want to be having LASIK during an earthquake. So that actually got funded by the legislature this session. So we'll be seeing that feasibility study going forward. So just to summarize, those were the 5 recommendations. We are not done yet. This is not the end of the story. These were the 5 things that rose to the top as the first things we ought to do. And we're still working with policymakers to see if we can't make all of these come to pass and be a reality. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Sean.
Thank you, Ari. And what a great example of the importance of a local nonprofit who really knows the area, knows the residents and what their values are, and is able to bridge that gap from how we communicating the risk in science and engineering, and how do you convey it to policy, and just a fantastic bridge. So thank you, Ari. Next up, we have Brent Maxfield, who's a structural engineer, and he has over 38 years of experience in both structural and seismic engineering. And Brent graduated magna cum laude in civil engineering from Brigham Young University, and also has a master's as well from BYU. And Brent, for almost 30 years, has been employed as a structural engineer with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where he's worked on projects across the US and around the world. So that'll hand it over to you. Thank you, Brent.
Well, thank you. It's great to have you with us in our webinar today. I'm going to be giving you an engineering perspective on seismic risk and resilience in Utah. And I have a lot to cover in just 8 minutes, so I'm going to go quickly here. Ari introduced the first topic, which I want to talk about, and that's our unreinforced masonry building problem in Utah. As Ari said, we built these clear into the 70s, and there are over 140,000 of these spread across the Wasatch Front, and these buildings will account for most deaths and injuries in future earthquakes. I want to talk quickly about the steps that have been taken over the past 30 years to address this problem. The first topic I want to talk about is this publication called the Utah Guide for Seismic Improvement of Unreinforced Masonry Dwellings. This first came out in 1996 and has had several revisions in that time. And it is a document that improves the performance of buildings, does not bring them up to current standards, but at least will tie the walls to the roof and brace masonry chimneys and give homeowners the details to understand the scope of work. The next thing that we did was this scenario for a magnitude 7.0 earthquake on the Wasatch Fault, Salt Lake City segment. This was co-sponsored by EERI and published in 2015. This is a great document to talk about the risk and the damage that will occur in a magnitude 7 earthquake along the Salt Lake City segment. But it also talks about unreinforced masonry buildings. And I want to bring up this quote that is from this document, talking about unreinforced masonry buildings. The social, financial, and political impact of this one building type's performance in a magnitude 7 earthquake will reach deeply into the fabric of Utah's communities. Facing this reality now means we must reorient our planning and safety concerns. It's a big deal, and the scenario highlights that. In 2019, FEMA sponsored a summit on unreinforced masonry buildings in Utah. This brought together stakeholders from throughout the state, where we discussed the problems and potential solutions for addressing our unreinforced masonry problem. It was a great summit, and we're grateful for FEMA for helping to organize that. One of the significant outcomes from that summit was this document called the Wasatch Front Unreinforced Masonry Risk Reduction Strategy. It came out last year in 2021 and has great information about the problem, but also great ideas for addressing the issues. And there were several recommendations that are in this reduction strategy, one of which Ari talked about in a little bit of detail, and that is this school study, the Utah K-12 Public School Unreinforced Masonry Inventory. I won't go into detail because Ari already talked about that. Ari mentioned the Salt Lake City Fix the Bricks program. This Fix the Bricks program began in 2016, and it uses federal pre-disaster mitigation grant money. This is similar to the home guide, which I talked about. It doesn't bring homes up to current code standards, but it does improve their performance. And since this program has begun, there have been hundreds of homes that have been strengthened using the funds from this program. The next thing I want to talk about are 3 ordinances that Utah has passed. Well, the first 2 are Utah ordinances. The third one is an ordinance that is passed by several jurisdictions. The first is the Utah Parapet Ordinance, is what we call it. It was a 1991 amendment to the Uniform Building Code. It is addressing specifically commercial buildings. The trigger was a re-roof of the building, and it addresses more than just parapets. It addresses cornices, spires, towers, tanks, statuary, and wall-to-roof connections. And quoting from the ordinance, it says, on buildings constructed prior to 1975, when re-roofing a commercial building. And then it requires that you engage an engineer or have a contractor engage an engineer, where the engineer creates the details and the contractor performs the work. Unfortunately, this ordinance has had haphazard enforcement over the years. Many owners and contractors were not aware of the ordinance. Many jurisdictions did not enforce the ordinance, and many projects did not get a building permit and therefore did not have a trigger to enforce the ordinance. The second ordinance is the Utah change of occupancy, which gave some retrofit triggers. The first trigger was a change of occupancy type. For example, if you had a warehouse and converted that to a restaurant or apartments, it would trigger a retrofit. And this ordinance was adopted in the early 2000s. The second trigger, which is a little bit unique, and that is if you stay within the same occupancy type, but increase your occupant load 100% or more, it also triggered the retrofit. And this, an example of this is if you had a restaurant that was expanding into another part of the building where the occupancy load was doubled. And it would require an upgrade to the IBC criteria, but also allows an upgrade standard such as the ASC 41. The third ordinance is the BORP, is the Building Occupancy Resumption Program. This was modeled after a San Francisco program, which allows owners to pre-certify post-earthquake inspection and tagging of their buildings. And at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the different tags that are attached to buildings as inspectors go out after an earthquake and inspect these buildings. Unfortunately, this program takes some time to get all of the inspectors out in the many different buildings that have been damaged. But if you have this program adopted, then an owner can have engineers that will be pre-certified and pre-deputized to go out and inspect those buildings and tag those buildings. It's really a win-win-win for the owner, for the city, and for the community to be able to get back into these buildings quickly. I want to switch topics now and talk about 3 major rehabilitation projects that have happened in Utah. The first I want to talk about is the city and county building. The construction for this one was finished in 1894. And in 1989, it became the world's first seismic base isolation retrofit project. In this building, there were 443 base isolators added under the existing building. It was quite a project back in the 1980s. At that time, the design displacement was only designed for 8 inches of displacement, and the motor would allow 18 inches of movement. And compare that with the state capitol building, which was constructed and finished in 1916. And then in 2008, a major renovation project was completed on the Capitol. And during this time, 265 lead rubber base isolators were installed and 15 sliders to accommodate a design displacement of 24 inches. And it has a moat gap of 27 inches. The current project, which is underway by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is a major renovation of the Salt Lake Temple. This project was completed in 1893 after 40 years of construction, and they are in the process right now of adding 98 triple pendulum isolators underneath the temple. And this project was designed with a design displacement of 60 inches and a moat of 66 inches. It's a fascinating project. There are current updates on the templesquare.org website. And so if you're curious about this project, you can go to that website and get more information. This project was designed for a scenario earthquake of a magnitude 7.2 on the Salt Lake segment of the Wasatch Fault. And it kind of goes along with my next topic, which is the ground motions values on new buildings along the Wasatch Front. Many people have a misunderstanding that the current code is designed for the scenario of a magnitude 7 earthquake on the Wasatch Front, but that is not accurate. The Wasatch Fault can generate ground motions that are significantly higher than the MCER values that we currently designed for along the Wasatch Front. And Ivan Wong made this comment having to do with time dependency versus time independency. So currently along the Wasatch Front, the building code does not consider the time since the last earthquake. But if we consider the time since the last earthquake, Ivan says this: the IBC may be unconservative for modern buildings along the Brigham City and Salt Lake City segments, because our recurrence, the time since our last event, has met or exceeded the recurrence intervals on those segments. If we look at the Wasatch Fault as a scenario and consider the actual event occurring for a Wasatch Fault earthquake, then all the facilities along the Wasatch Fault that we're currently building would be unconservative when looking at the potential ground shaking. And so we've got a special session coming up at the NCEE that addresses this topic. It's the name of the special session is, does the building code adequately protect the Wasatch Front communities from a Wasatch Fault earthquake? We will have presentations from Christopher DeRoss, Nico Luco, and Craig Wilkinson. And following those presentations, we'll add panelists who are experts and code writers. We'll have John Hooper, Charlie Kircher, and Ivan Wong join us for that panel discussion. We hope you can join us for that session. We know it will be a very important session as we talk about our risk along the Wasatch Front. That completes my topic, and I'll thank you for attending, and I'll turn the time back over to our moderator.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brent. I appreciate it. And if you ever wondered if you'd hear about cornices and triple pendulum isolators in the same presentation as planning and urban design, you're at an EERI webinar. So thank you, Brent. I love that. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Divya Chandrasekhar, who is an associate professor at University of Utah's Department of City and Metro Planning. And she has a real strong expertise in community recovery from disasters with a really good emphasis on equity as well. And her research has examined what happens during post-disaster community recovery planning, as well as community participation and capacity building in South and Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, as well as domestically in the US. And Dr. Chandrasekhar is a member of the Utah Seismic Safety Commission, that same group I already mentioned earlier, and the Utah State Hazard Mitigation Team, and the Roundtable on Risk and Resilience of Extreme Events at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And Divya received her master's and PhD degrees in urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Probably some of your alums are there with all the engineers on the call, and hold a bachelor's degree in physical planning from the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you, Divya, for joining us.
Thank you, Sean, for that introduction. I'm very excited to talk today about a bigger picture of how Utah is working on resilience, especially earthquake resilience planning, in a very collaborative fashion. You've heard pieces of this throughout today's webinar. I'm going to focus a little bit more on those aspects. I think everybody would probably agree that communities are more than just structures, right? We understand that our structures are very important foundation for our communities, but there are many systems in place in communities that also need to be focused on. Our social systems, our economic systems, cultural systems, all of those together play a role in making communities whole. And so any good earthquake risk reduction, earthquake resilience strategy worth its salt has to approach this problem comprehensively, holistically. And so risk reduction strategies of many types aimed at businesses like at buildings like URM retrofitting has to consider more than just the building. And Utah has done some things that lend to that pretty well. So you've heard of at least two of these today. You've heard of the Wasatch Front unreinforced risk reduction strategy and the masonry, the schools URM inventory that just came out. And apart from the fact that they're very collaborative documents that have cut across sectors, what's special about some of these documents is, for example, in the risk reduction strategy, it really emphasizes stakeholder engagement, early stakeholder engagement, and sustained stakeholder engagement throughout the process. And the understanding here is that if we involve the communities from a very early stage, then not only are we building trust in the process, and communities are more likely to undertake those policy actions, adopt the kind of strategies that are being developed, but that also the strategy meets community needs, makes it more relevant, right? So we're really hitting the mark where the community needs it. And in the inventory case, the inventory is basically telling us which schools are URM and what their status is, but the document doesn't stop there. What it says in addition is that if you're going to make decisions about, say, policy making, one of the things you could do is take this assessment and put it in conjunction with, say, a social vulnerability index, a SOVI, for example. And that would give another criteria for which communities to invest in, increases the equity outcomes of our decision making, ensures that the schools in underserved communities are perhaps catered to first before other kinds of places. And I think the importance of what these documents are doing through the process, by focusing on the process of developing these strategies, is that they're building communities, not just retrofitting your buildings. And that's something that good earthquake resilience planning should do. And if you've heard of these, of course, but there's also other exciting things that are happening in Utah. For example, we have recovery frameworks, disaster recovery frameworks, both at the county and at the state level. And this is unique because we are one of the few states and places to do this before a major disaster has struck. And this requires thinking proactively. For those of you who might study recovery, you understand it's done under very high stress, uncertain environments, it's not always possible to think. You only have time to act during recovery. And so making these documents before the disaster strikes really allows the time to think about what needs to be done, who needs to be contacted, how will different organizations coordinate, what will they act on, how will you figure out what you need to do. So all of that stuff, the process of it, you do it now proactively. And so all these documents and these efforts, these plans, and you've heard of Envision Utah's fabulous work, they're really about giving the problem a holistic approach, thinking across different sectors, thinking across different systems, community systems at play, and trying to make a difference there. There's also collaborative research. I think it reflects on some of these same sort of things. I'm only going to give two examples here, but there are many universities and they do really great research with with a lot of our local partners. But we, for example, at the University of Utah, are doing a project which assesses the economic impact of road disruptions due to a 7.0 magnitude earthquake in the Wasatch Front. And what this is doing is it's extending your typical hazardous MH impact and giving it a slightly more like finer grain impact assessment, and also allowing our local organizations and DEM, for example, to make proactive policies for specific types of industries. And that's done in collaboration with our state organization, our local metropolitan agency, and us. We're also doing other research on improving response planning by adding AI elements into response training for concurrent disasters, that is, two disasters happening simultaneously. And that we have experienced a lot of in Utah in the last 2 years with the pandemic and an earthquake and a windstorm, an inland hurricane event. And so it's become really something very important to us, is to be able to respond to these kinds of simultaneous disasters. What I want to point out here, of course, is that these research initiatives, they come out of multiple collaborations, and these collaborations really span both disciplinary and sectoral boundaries. So there's lots of nonprofits and government organizations and universities that make this kind of research happen. And that the ideas for the research are also coming out of the partners. Both the projects, for example, in these cases, were approached to us. The people came and said to us at the university, we need something like this. And then we started these research projects. And a lot of this collaborative work depends on networking and capacity building, which, as you realized on this panel, really reflects a lot of what's happening in Utah is good networking, right? Lots of great potential for collaboration. And at least some of this is attributed to the type of events that have been held. You heard about the seminar, the symposium that was held earlier on earthquake risk reduction, but we also hold at the University of Utah, the Utah Disaster Resilience Symposium. We've been holding it for the past many years now. And at least in 2019, we had a disaster professionals networking event where we invited people from different disciplines and different kinds of sectors, nonprofits, et cetera, to come and speak to each other. What are we doing together? What are you doing? And what am I doing? And the notion of having these conversations and building some trust relationships, and therefore increasing our collaborative potential in the future. And so these are some of the things that Utah's doing that's kind of nice and really energizing, sort of lends the dynamism to some of the work that you're seeing in Utah. But the picture is not full. There's a lot to be done. For example, we really need to operationalize what equity and social justice means. How do you actually translate this into action? How do you measure this? How do we evaluate ourselves towards progress in this field? We need to do some more thinking along those lines. We also need to bridge this gap between hazards and development. What we really want is that the urban planner should be talking about earthquakes, not just the emergency manager, right, or the structural engineer. And so we really need to figure out how to break those silos between these communities of practice. That will make us stronger. We also need to focus a lot more on rural resilience, because that's a lot of the Intermountain West. And a lot of these communities are less resourced. We have to start thinking more about rural resilience. If you were paying attention to Emily Kleber's presentation early on, she mentioned how there is disaster risk even in rural areas, but we tend to talk about the Wasatch Front. We need to start thinking about that a lot more. And lastly, we need a lot better outreach and collaboration with our neighbors. the tribal nations are here in the Intermountain West. There's a lot of them, and there's not enough talking to each other. There needs to be more conversations, more collaborations, and more learning from each other that needs to happen. And with that, I just want to say thank you, and that we will be having a special session as well on the Magna earthquake. There are a couple of them, so I hope you will attend.
Great, thank you so much, Divya. Appreciate that, and appreciate all of our panelists taking some time out to share your expertise with us. I definitely learned a bunch, and hopefully everybody else did too. And judging by the comments and the Q&A, I think people are pretty excited about this one. So we do have some time for question and answer, and I see a few questions in there. If you had any questions that got sparked based on discussion, please put them in the Q&A, just right down below in Zoom. And I'll start with the first one from Justin Moresco at Applied Technology Council. And if nobody on the call was able to answer this, that's okay. We can get back to you, Justin, later. But the question is, does the USGS hazard model referenced by the US Building Code include the time-depending modeling along the Wasatch Front as described by Emily?
I can address that. So the current building code does not address time dependency. And as I mentioned, that quote from Ivan Wong, that if time dependency was considered, then the Salt Lake segment and the Brigham City segment would have ground motions increased because of the time since the last earthquake. And both of those, the time independent and the time dependent models are still different than looking at a scenario where the actual earthquake happens. And then those ground motions are exceed even the time dependent models.
Excellent, thank you, Brent. I figured you might have an answer for that one. I appreciate that. Also, that's terrifying. Next question is asking if you recall if the URM buildings in Utah are predominantly clay brick or concrete block masonry, or if both, what the breakdown might be between the two materials.
My guess is that most of those are the actual clay masonry, unreinforced masonry, but I know I used to live in a house that had a 4-inch concrete block on the inside and then a 4-inch layer of brick on the outside. So it was a combination of the two. But the inventory also includes the unreinforced clay concrete block.
Great, thanks, Brent. And another question is asking if EERI, or the Structural Engineers Association of Utah, or SEAU, they considered, I think this is going back to RIT or comments on legislative recommendations, if part of the recommendation was also looking at geotech engineers, if they would peer review the geotech seismic hazards for those risk category 3 and 4 buildings.
And I don't know, Brent may know whether that conversation's happened. I have not heard that conversation happen. It's important to recognize that in Utah, any proposal that reviews be more stringent is very, very hard to get across the finish line here. So we're very careful in recommending anything along those lines unless we know it's worth the political headache, I guess. So anyway.
Yeah, and in my understanding, I don't think that sort of proposal of having those peer reviewed has been approached in terms of a legislative bill.
Thank you, Brent and Ari. We have a couple more good questions in here. So another one is about resiliency measures and asking which measures might be taken to improve transportation systems, rail, bridge, highway, etc. Are there any transportation systems that are already resilient? And if so, how is that measured, or how do we know?
Well, I can take a shot at that answer. The answer is somewhat. There are some transportation systems that are already being retrofitted. For instance, I think highways are being retrofitted one at a time. And as the events happen, of course, the target sometimes changes. But there have been efforts to do that. We have a new airport. And when we did our analysis on supply chain, we found that Hazes, for instance, predicts that the new airport will have a recovery of 1 day. So we don't expect a lot of interruption in air travel. What we do expect is roads and bridges, for example. So it's working, it's a work in progress sort of a thing. In terms of whether we have any criteria for resilience right now, a lot of those criteria are structural criteria. And definitely it's about the physical aspect of these structures, and it's something to think about, is to increase the measures of resilience to be more socioeconomic as well.
then maybe a related question. I see it just came in, but I'll let it jump the line. It ties into what Divya was talking about. This one is going to Ari and looking at, is some of the infrastructure that's being evaluated, does it include liquid storage tanks? It says you mentioned water aqueducts, which is great, but what about water tanks or any other Utah industry with large liquid storage? I think also maybe like mining tailings might be relevant here, and retrofitting them to meet current code. Is that up for discussion at all as part of these recommendations from the Seismic Commission?
Yeah, I mean, we started with those aqueducts. As we've talked to the various water districts, the water tanks are an issue as well as we have some water treatment plants that are still fairly old that are also an issue. So we're still having discussions about what we can do about those. As far as some of the other liquid storage tanks you mentioned, I haven't really been in part of any discussions about those. So
great, thanks. Anybody else care to chime in or have additional input?
I just have to say, if you're curious about where the Wasatch Fault is, you can typically look for big water storage tanks because they fit really nicely on the footwall of the Wasatch Fault.
And I think I'll add, our water districts have actually been pretty good at adding emergency shutoff valves to those water tanks. So we've made some progress.
And something I've heard repeatedly from in Utah is that the water supply folks generally say, yeah, we have things pretty well nailed down. There's a lot of work to do, but if there's no, we can be the inlet, but there's no outlet that's surviving the earthquake, we can't turn on the water because there's nowhere for it to go, and that itself is terrifying. So we thank you, Ari, for jumping in, and Emily as well. And another question gets back to the codes a little bit. I think this is going back to the having a structural engineer be involved in the inspections of category 3 and 4 buildings. And it says, I do not see any solid ties or references with International Building Code or American Society of Civil Engineers Standard 7. It appears the work is being done in tangent or parallel in terms of occupancies and seismic design categories and their requirements. Am I right in this perception?
So I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but let me just say a couple of things. Number one, we do adopt the most current version of the International Building Code in ASCE 7. So we are, as a state, building to that code right now. In terms of the retrofit that has a trigger, it does reference back to the ASC 41 code. So that becomes the upgrade standard for existing buildings that are triggered to do the upgrade. If we talk about fix the bricks and the guide to homeowners, the homeowners guide, that does not specifically refer back to ASCE 7, ASC 41. They're just prescriptive things that will tend to increase the performance of those buildings, but do not bring them up to a specific standard. So I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, maybe retype a different question and we'll try and answer that.
Thank you so much, Brent. And going in a totally different direction, this question asks if there's any cultural or heritage vulnerability in Utah. And if yes, how do they stay protected and retrofitted? So I imagine this is more like historically significant buildings or culturally important structures.
Well, there are two parts to that question. There's the obvious tribal nations, lands, and the kinds of structures that exist there. And frankly, we are so siloed that we don't know. The tribal nations emergency management agencies sort of are working on their own. And that's, like I said, one of the major issues here. So we really need to communicate better. So what's happening on tribal lands is not evident to those outside. On the other hand, which is maybe they're measuring, maybe they're not measuring. In terms of other types of cultural vulnerabilities, we do have diverse populations in Utah. We have our own minority communities, and they also live in unreinforced masonry homes. So the answer to that is yes, they do have vulnerability, and those are probably emanating from the socioeconomic and political statuses, their characteristics. So if there's anything particular, it kind of depends on the population, but at the least, that is the case. So if the question is, do they live in risky areas, the answer is absolutely yes. And do we need to pay more attention to these populations? The answer is absolutely yes. What exactly the vulnerability is, you will not know unless you don't go and actually ask.
And then thank you, Divya, that was a great answer. And then in terms of like any historic buildings, I can tackle this one a little bit. So after the Magna earthquake, the first agency really out the door looking at buildings like the Emily was out in the field looking at any kind of geologic information. The emergency management staff were in the emergency operations center working on managing the whole disaster. But the first group to actually look at buildings was the Environmental State Historic Preservation Office. And we actually used their data at FEMA and at the state to look at what had happened to unreinforced masonry buildings. And they had their data the best when it came to historic buildings. And it was just a fantastic deployment they had out. They didn't wait for anybody else to give them the go ahead or whatever. They just jumped right out there and looked at all the older buildings. And thank God, because we know perishable data are so important. And I think that was very important to capture, hey, these buildings are vulnerable and also historic and part of the culture. And in some cases, the people inside them are, as Divya mentioned, are vulnerable as well. So sometimes you have these historic buildings that can come down, and then people inside them aren't as resilient as the rest of the population. And so really important data to gather and think about the people inside those buildings. And a couple other questions. I think this one's pretty easy to answer. Is, has earthquake early warning been widely used or deployed? And to answer that question real quick, the bill that Ari mentioned before is to do some exploratory study to see if it's viable, given how close the fault is with the population, but also how high the risk is, to see if there's a way for it to be useful. And Emily, anything you maybe want to add on that? Or
no, it's just other than, just it'll show the federal side, the USGS has their sights set on tier 2 states, including Utah. So they're very focused on the West Coast right now. So it's a really great, I think it opens up a big door of opportunity for potentially having earthquake early warning in Utah. So yeah, we're very happy with that result.
Okay. Well, thanks, Emily. And Mountain West states are tier 2 for that effort, but tier 1 in our hearts. And as I think there's one more question as we run out of time, and I know we couldn't get to all the questions, but one really big one is, what are the main roadblocks with the legislature lobbyists in getting more proactive bills passed for seismic resilience? I won't comment on this one, but I imagine some others might be able to, and welcome any feedback you might have.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I think there are a number of roadblocks. One is there's really no natural constituency that's out there lobbying for these things. We're trying to help fill that void a little bit. Another roadblock is just that there are so many needs. A lot of these things cost money, and there are so many other worthy needs in the state that also need money. So you're competing with things where it's really hard to say, those kids don't need that money over there, that kind of thing. And then I think kind of the third barrier that we've seen is in Utah, we have a very strong real estate community when it comes to the legislature. A lot of legislators came out of the real estate community, and it's a very strong lobby. And so you really have to deal with them as a player in getting anything done at the legislature. So when you're starting to talk about building codes and reviews of building plans and things like that, that's the elephant in the room you got to deal with. So I don't know if anyone wants to add to any of those barriers, but
I just add forgetfulness. It seems that we tell the story over and over again, and it seems to be forgotten in the legislative sessions year after year. But we have built a nice run of successes, and we're looking to parlay that into the future with more work being done here in the state.
Thanks. Great to see you, Barry. Barry's my co-chair for the 12 NCEE coming up in June. I'd encourage you to register if you haven't already. And with that, I will hand it back over to Elizabeth for some closing comments. But we appreciate you all joining us and hope to see you in Salt Lake City. It's going to be great weather at the end of June. It's right before the 4th of July weekend. Bring the family, go for a hike, have an adventure, take Emily's tour, looking at up in the mountains at the geology. And Brent has some great tours as well for some retrofits in town. And I hope to see you all then.
From ERI, thank you guys so much for attending. We'd like to ask you to please complete the post-webinar survey, which will pop up on your screen after the webinar ends. If you want to learn more about ERI, you can visit our website and you can find out how to join there. If you want to learn about upcoming webinars, you can check out our Pulse newsletter online. And finally, we want to thank FEMA for helping fund webinars like these, and also especially ERI members like you for supporting our work and making events like this possible. And I hope we'll see you all in Utah this summer.
Yes, look forward to seeing you all. Thank you.